And I will start my screen sharing now as well. I think you are all able to see. And then let me just make my video a little bigger so I could see some folks as well. Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CMS workshop on the Clean Mile Standard Phase 1 staff proposal. Thank you for joining us. This is under rulemaking R.21-11-014. My name is Stephanie Secchi, and I'm the lead analyst on the Clean Mile Standard. I have a few colleagues here with me as well who will provide support throughout, including Sarah Curtis, who's the Transportation Policy and Programs Manager, and Josh Honeycutt, who's the Transportation Policy Supervisor. So to start, I just want to do a couple of quick housekeeping items. Just a note and a reminder that the staff proposal is the document on record, and the forthcoming party comment should reference that staff proposal document. The purpose of this workshop is to have staff share what's in the staff proposal, to answer any clarifying questions, and to engage with stakeholders. We have dedicated question and comment sections, and I'll let you know when those come up. And when they do, we'll ask you to come off mute, or you can always share your questions in the chat as well, but we'll have some facilitated questions and comments during those sections. We will be monitoring the chat box, like I said, just as we go along. If any questions come up, feel free to add them into the chat box. If you can't use the chat box or are having issues, feel free to email cleanmiles@cpuc.ca.gov. We have someone who will be monitoring that email as well if any issues come up. We also have IT support on the call as well. And at any time during the presentation, I'll be doing a lot of speaking and slide sharing. So if there are any issues with audio or the presentation, let me know. This meeting is being recorded. We will share the presentation slides and the recording on the CMS CPUC website after the workshop. If you would like closed captioning, there's a button at the bottom of the WebEx on the left side, which you can turn on if you would like. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, put them in the chat, or also email cleanmiles@cpuc.ca.gov. And then one additional thing, we have a Spanish interpretation line. So if you would like a Spanish interpretation, you have to dial into a separate line. The number is listed here, 800-857-1917, and enter the public access code. If you are on the Spanish interpretation line and you would like to make a comment, you can do so, but you have to press *1 first and provide your name when prompted. When we get to the question and comment sessions, I will ask Claudia, who's facilitating that line, to if there's anyone who'd like to make comment, and I'll just leave this up for a second longer if anyone would like to join. And just a reminder, since there will be some interpretation, if you are asking or answering questions, to try to speak slowly and clearly to make sure that everything is interpreted or is easier to interpret. And I will try to remember that as well. Okay, so those are the housekeeping items. Now I would like to introduce Commissioner Shiroma. She is the assigned commissioner on the Clean Mile Standard proceeding to provide opening remarks. So I'm going to actually stop sharing my slides and ask that Commissioner Shiroma be spotlighted.
Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome, everybody. I've been looking forward to this workshop. Staff has put forward a robust proposal for a program that is really a first of its kind. The transportation sector accounts for almost 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in California when you account for fuel production, with light-duty vehicles making up to 70% of the transportation sector's direct emissions. And with the enactment of SB 1014, which was adopted in 2018, the Clean Mile Standard and Incentive Program, both the California Air Resources Board and the California Public Utilities Commission are tasked with developing and implementing new requirements to curb greenhouse gas emissions as new mobility options grow at a rapid pace. For those who have reviewed the proposal, you can see staff has devoted particular attention to the statutory requirements to minimize any negative impacts of this proposed regulation on transportation network company drivers. Now, the metrics themselves have already been adopted by the California Air Resources Board. We are responsible for the implementation of those metrics. I encourage stakeholders to make sure that we've captured the full range of potential impacts to drivers and identified core strategies to mitigate those impacts. Secondly, I would like to hear how can we best implement the driver's assistance program with a third-party administrator. We can look to examples in the energy space, such as the solar on multifamily affordable housing, or SOMA, or the self-generation incentive program, which is SCHIP. But we need to make adjustments to the details as you all inform us whether there is something specific from your perspective, something that is unique to the work that we are doing on the Clean Mile Standard, the factual matters that we need to consider for drivers, for a third-party administrator. I'd like to thank the CMS team for their dedicated work on this. Thank you to Tara Curtis, Judge Stephanie Wong, Josh Honeycutt, and especially to Stephanie Secchi, who is our facilitator today. I also want to, and for the whole team, the whole TNC team. I also want to thank my Chief of Staff, Cheryl Wynn, and my Transportation Advisor, Andrew Dukeson, for their wise counsel. I look forward to today's conversation, and I know it will be a productive one. Thank you, and back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Commissioner Shiroma, and I'm grateful that you provided some of the background on Clean Mile Standard as well, because I actually don't have slides on that, so that was a nice addition to get us started. I will share my slides again and get us going. Okay. So we have a 3-hour-long workshop today. Hopefully it will not be me speaking the entire time, but I will talk for the beginning part of the workshop and giving the staff proposal presentation. And then we will have 3 sessions that follow that are more interactive, where we want to hear from you and we'll have time for you to ask questions and provide comments. The first will be focused on questions about the staff proposal itself. Then we'll have a staff guided Q&A that will focus on more specific topics, and then just a shorter public comment open period for any additional comments that you all may have. And we should be ending right at 4. So just to get folks up to speed as to how we got where we are right now, this is just a brief timeline of where we've been. A little over a year ago, the order instituting rulemaking was made. That was in November of last year. Since then, we had a pre-hearing conference in February, a first workshop in March, the scoping memo and post-workshop report rulings in April, and then most recently, the phase 1 staff proposal, which was filed last month on November 17th. We are at the staff proposal workshop now, and then in January and February, the opening comments and reply comments will be due. You may have noticed today that the deadlines were extended. So now the opening comments are due January 30th, and the reply comments are due February 27th. And I have a few reminders of that throughout the rest of the slides as well. So I'm going to get into the first session, which is on the staff proposal itself. So I'll be walking through the highlights of the staff proposal with you. It's a challenge to cover all of the details in the staff proposal in a short amount of time. So we do encourage everyone to read the proposal for the details. And I'm asking that you save your questions for the next session. You can always enter them into the chat as we go along, and we'll facilitate answers to those in the next session, but I won't pause to take questions. We'll just work our way through these. So I will present a slide for each of the topics shown here, and these correspond to the staff proposal sections, the ruling questions, as well as attachment B in the staff proposal ruling that includes summary bullet points. So that they should be able to reference between them easily, or trying to make it easier to really digest all of the topics within the proposal. And I'm going to start with defined terms. So this is just to kind of set the stage for a new term that we've proposed, which is called CMS regulated entities, which we've described as the subset of entities that are subject to the Clean Mile Standard. Staff proposes to include transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, but also autonomous vehicles used for passenger services. And you'll see that we, in the proposal, we use the term CMS regulated entities throughout, and I will also do that throughout the presentation as well. For the Carb targets, the framework and timeline, I think there's a lot to digest here as well. And I have some additional slides on the timeline in a later session, because I know it can be complicated to wrap your head around it. But to start, as Commissioner Sharma mentioned, the California Air Resources Board established the greenhouse gas emissions and electric vehicle miles traveled targets for CMS compliance beginning in 2023 and out to 2030. The goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile traveled through more efficient and zero emission vehicles driving on the platforms, more electric miles driven, and more pooled rides. The staff proposes holding CMS regulated entities to the annual targets starting in 2023. But we have requested that the CMS regulated entities provide a status update on their progress towards meeting the 2023 annual targets. Some of the timeline highlights, and again, there'll be more details on these as well, include the submission of a partial GHG or greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan by the CMS regulated entities within 90 days of the phase 1 decision, with phase 2 issues likely taking additional time into 2024. For the driver's assistance program, which you'll hear more about in a couple of slides, we're anticipating the deliverables for the program administrator of the driver's assistance program to be in late 2024. But again, all of these elements are related in series and dependent on the timing of the decision. So the section on low and moderate income drivers is a pretty large section of the proposal, and ensuring minimal negative impact on low and moderate income drivers is part of the statute. It's a major part of the staff proposed implementation of CMS. Staff propose a definition for low and moderate income drivers that is California specific and used by other agencies like Carb, with limits set based on annual driver income, and values set for low income at $56,896 and moderate income at $85,344, which would be updated annually, or proposed to be updated annually. The implementation has a proposed focus on minimizing financial impacts on low and moderate income drivers, with the proposal of a driver's assistance program to provide resources on transitioning to zero emission vehicles for all drivers, as well as financial incentives for low and moderate income drivers who will be transitioning to zero emission vehicles. Staff has proposed a few methods for establishing the incentive amounts, and request comment on the appropriate method. So if you look in the low and moderate income driver section of the proposal, for a vehicle-related incentive and a charging-related incentive. Staff have proposed 3 different ways of evaluating and ask for comment on the most appropriate way to do so. Staff also proposes providing compensation to drivers who engage with CMS throughout implementation, including through the proposed driver working group, annual driver surveys, as well as workshops. The program would also require that CMS regulated entities describe how they will ensure a minimal negative impact on low and moderate income drivers in their greenhouse gas plans. And staff propose an annual low and moderate income driver impact report to assess the goal of minimizing negative impact. For the driver's assistance program, as described a bit in the last slide, this is proposed to provide additional resources to all drivers and financial incentives to low and moderate income drivers who are making a transition to zero emission vehicles. It's proposed to be funded through a regulatory fee that will be proposed by the CMS regulated entities in their greenhouse gas plans. And the fee should be set to cover the program expenses to a level that enables the CMS regulated entities to meet their annual targets. Staff proposes that the driver's assistance program will be managed by a third-party program administrator who will be procured through an RFP process conducted by one of the CMS regulated entities, who we refer to in the proposal as the contracting agent. And CPUC would have oversight throughout this process. Staff proposes that the program administrator has deliverables to the CPUC as well, including an implementation plan, a handbook, and data reporting. And you'll see in the proposal much more detail around the budget for the program administrator and administrative costs, as well as how the contracting agent setup would work. For the program, staff has proposed both programmatic evaluation of the driver's assistance program, the program administrator, and the CMS regulated entities, as well as financial audits of the CMS regulated entities throughout implementation. The evaluation and audits are proposed to be funded through the same driver's assistance program regulatory fee, and RFPs for the evaluation contractor and auditor to be conducted through the contracting agent with CPUC oversight as well. The evaluation and audit are proposed to occur at least twice through implementation, with the specifics on the timeline detailed in the proposal, but a little bit also dependent on when exactly everything before then starts. Like the submission of the first decision, submission of the greenhouse gas emissions plans. For the greenhouse gas emissions reduction plans, or we refer to them in short as the GHG plans, so it's kind of a mouthful if you say the whole name over and over again. This is a major element of CMS implementation. And these GHG plans will be submitted by the CMS regulated entities. The proposal recommends that the first GHG plan, which we refer to as a partial GHG plan, be submitted by the CMS regulated entities within 90 days of the first decision on phase 1 issues. And that is the reason why we have referred to them as partial GHG plans. It's that we are intending that they would only cover the phase 1 issues. So any issues that were covered in phase 2 would be updated in a subsequent GHG plan once the phase 2 issues are decided. But in general, staff propose getting us back to even year submissions of the GHG plans as specified in statute. It's just the earlier plans that might be a little bit different. Staff propose a Tier 3 advice letter process for submittal of the partial and full GHG plans, which go through public comment and commission resolution. The proposal details the elements of the narrative plan and the supplemental calculations, which are the main 2 sections of the GHG plan as proposed, as well as the scorecard review method. where staff will review the plans for completeness, feasibility, and accuracy using a scorecard system to assess if the elements are exemplary, sufficient, or deficient. If modified GHG plans are required, staff propose they are submitted via a Tier 1 advice letter for staff to review, ensure that the modifications have been made. And any deviations from approved GHG plans are proposed to be handled via Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 advice letters, depending on the nature of the deviation. And those are detailed within the staff proposal as well. For compliance and enforcement, in the proposal, staff establishes the Commission authority to enforce CMS program, the CMS program and targets set by Carb. It also describes some issues that could require compliance, but the details of a potential enforcement program will be determined in phase 2. Moving on to clean mobility, we're making our way through here. So meeting the goals of clean mobility are specified in statute. For CMS, staff proposes that the goals of clean mobility can be met through providing low and moderate income individuals, in other words, drivers, with access to zero emission vehicles, and providing low and moderate income communities with rides in zero emission vehicles from the CMS regulated entities. CMS regulated entities will describe in their GHG plans how their proposals will support the goals of clean mobility, and will provide data to support assessment of progress made towards those goals. And in the proposal, we describe that assessment being made in the biennial, or the proposed biennial unanticipated barriers and progress reports, which you'll hear come up a bunch of times. For outreach and engagement, staff propose that outreach and engagement focus heavily on drivers and community-based organizations or other organizations who are otherwise less engaged in the CMS process to ensure that we have broad perspectives on policies and implementation. The driver engagement will be the responsibility of CMS regulated entities, the Driver's Assistance Program and Program Administrator, and CPUC. Each will have a role in the driver engagement process. On the CPUC side, staff have proposed a driver working group, an annual driver survey, and an annual, I think I've already mentioned, low and moderate income driver impact report. Staff also proposed a staff-led implementation working group with representatives from a wide set of organizations, including CMS regulated entities, drivers, non-governmental organizations, and community-based organizations, including transportation equity organizations, EV charging companies, vehicle manufacturers, other government entities, and researchers as well. And staff have received requests for translation and interpretation services in the past and propose that driver engagement includes appropriate services for drivers. In terms of data, the proposal includes many data fields to cover the topics that will need to be assessed and evaluated throughout implementation, including compliance for GHG plans on low and moderate income drivers, clean mobility, environmental and social justice evaluations and exemptions. Many of the data fields, many of them come from the Carb regulation, the final regulation order. Others we have added from PNC annual reports, and there's overlap between the different issues. So if you look in Appendix B of the staff proposal, you'll see quite a long table that includes the proposed data fields as well as for which issue they apply. And you'll see overlap between the issues. So one data field could be used to assess a number of the different issues. I encourage you to look through those as well. Staff proposes that CMS regulated entities attest to the accuracy of the data and also submit to data evaluations or audits. And staff also recommends following General Order D for data sharing and suggest a future public data sharing portal. On coordination with transportation electrification, staff proposed to continue to work with other agencies on transportation electrification issues, like folks at the California Energy Commission, as well as the Energy Division at CPUC, to ensure that CMS-related issues are communicated across agencies. Staff also proposed more ad hoc transportation electrification workshops on CMS-specific issues, which could be identified through the coordination activities, through the working groups that staff are holding, but really trying to focus on what is relevant to CMS to make sure that issues that are understood. Findings from the coordination efforts and workshops are proposed to be incorporated into the annual low and moderate income driver impact report, as well as the biennial unanticipated barriers and progress report as appropriate. And staff also recommends the program administrator coordinate with other entities on transportation electrification related incentives for drivers, or those that might be available to them, particularly around charging infrastructure. In terms of environmental and social justice for CMS, environmental and social justice will focus on low and moderate income drivers and communities, and there's quite a bit of overlap with the goals of clean mobility as well, including overlap in the definition of low and moderate income communities. CMS regulated entities will describe in their greenhouse gas plans how their proposal will support, in particular, two of the CPUC ES environmental and social justice action items from the action plan, which include action item 3.1.2 for the implementation of clean mile standard and impact on drivers from ESJ communities, as well as action item 2.2.5, which is improving access to EV charging for ESJ communities. CMS regulated entities will also be asked to report data to support tracking of progress towards these goals, which will be assessed through the biennial unanticipated barriers and progress report as well. In terms of the exemptions, staff proposed adopting the Carb exemptions for what they described as small TNCs, as well as wheelchair accessible vehicle trips. Staff proposed some additions as well, including making the exemption language include the broader CMS regulated entities term, which includes AVs and passenger services, as well as specifying inclusion of periods 1, 2, and 3 in the annual vehicle miles traveled calculation. So for that exemption, CMS regulated entities who have fewer than 5 million vehicle miles traveled annually would be exempt from CMS. And for the wheelchair accessible vehicle, same thing, just applying the CMS regulated entities term to the exemption as Carb has written it. And in that case, the wheelchair accessible vehicle trips are exempt from the GHG calculation. For both cases, staff proposes collecting data, location data that will enable us to assess the exemption and to ensure that there are no unintended environmental and social justice community impacts. And again, propose supporting and tracking of progress on this through the biennial and anticipated barriers and progress report. Which brings us to the last slide. And the proposal for the unanticipated barriers and progress report. So this is a report that would cover the required unanticipated barriers review per statute, and also encompass progress reporting on major CMS issues, as mentioned in some of the previous slides, and details in the proposal. And this is just a note that the details of the unanticipated barriers review is designated as a phase 2 issue. So actually that was my last slide. I didn't need as much time as I thought I would, but that just means that we'll have more time for questions in the next session as well as the ones that follow. And I'll try to allocate, I'll still try to keep us on time, and I'll try to allocate them between the sessions. But thank you for listening to me. So for this next session, we wanted to open it up for you to ask any questions that you have on the staff proposal. Maybe you already had them because you read through the staff proposal or the summary bullets, or maybe the presentation and the slides that I presented brought up some questions for you. We will use the raised hand feature. Let me go one slide. If you look in the WebEx, you should see the little hand symbol at the bottom, or if you look at the participants list next to your name, if you hover over it, you should be able to hit the hand symbol there as well. If you're having issues with that, please email cleanmiles@cpuc.ca.gov, and we'll try to help you with that. But also, if you're having issues with the raise hand, we'll take questions from phone line and the Spanish interpretation line as well. So Sarah is going to help to facilitate any questions that come through the chat, or if I can't see hands raised, to help with that as well. When you are called upon, please say your name first and your affiliation. And then if you are using the raise hand feature, just remember to unclick the raise hand when you're done. Just a note for the Spanish interpretation line as well. If you would like to make a comment, you have to press *1 first and then provide your name. And Claudia will help facilitate those questions as well. Okay, so maybe I'll just leave it on this slide for now. And Claudia, do we have, I can't see the chat actually, so let me just see if I can pull it up. Do we have any comments or questions from the Spanish line?
None from the Spanish line at this time.
Okay, thank you. And Tara, can you help me by calling on folks or pulling from the chat box?
Yes. So I see one hand raise, Gabriel from Gig Workers Rising first, and then I see a separate question in the chat I'll read after. Gabriel Cardenas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Gabriel Cardenas. I'm an organizer with Gig Workers Rising. And the question that I have is, will TNCs be expected to implement emissions reductions plan before the driver assistance program goes into effect? If so, how will we ensure drivers are not harmed by the transition during this period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the greenhouse gas, so there is, the way that the timeline is proposed is the CMS regulated entities will submit their greenhouse gas emissions plans. Once they're approved, that would start basically the collection of, well, I should take a step back. Once they're submitted, that would start the timeline for the program administrator procurement, basically the RFP process for the program administrator. But not until the plans are approved by the commission would the fee collection start. So there's kind of a, we're trying to make it efficient because we want the program to get started when it's appropriate. But yes, there will be a bit of time because we're allowing a 6-month period for the program administrator contract to come into place, where the program administrator would not be set up yet, but the plans will have been approved. But once the plans are approved, that would start the fee collection process. So at a minimum, the money to support the driver assistance program and provide support to low and moderate income drivers would have started already. I will also invite Tara to add any comments if you would like.
Nothing to add. All right.
Great, thank you. Do I just get one question or should I like wait for the next person?
Gabriel, if you have a follow-up, please feel free to ask it now. I think I'll come back to you after other questions in the chat if it's a separate question.
Great, thank you.
All right. So Steph, the second question is from Rideshare Drivers United in the chat, and they ask, how are you proposing that the driver advisory group be selected?
So the driver, I believe you're referring to the driver working group, and in the proposal, the kind of details around the driver working group are, I think, what's specified are the number and the representation. I think it's 8 to 12. I would refer to the staff proposal for the exact numbers, but I think it's 8 to 12. And we want it to be representative, meaning that we would like there to be low and moderate income drivers as part of the driver working group. And there is a 6-month period, I think, of recruiting drivers. We would need to work, since it's a staff-led, it's proposed to be a staff-led driver working group. Staff would be relying on our connections to the drivers to build up the driver working group and try to make it as representative of the driver population as possible. But we would, as we do for getting information out about our workshops and other CMS-related engagement that we do, would be relying on getting the message out there. So that would rely on the CMS-regulated entities as well to try to create a representative driver working group. Thank you.
Okay. Any follow-up clarification questions on that one from Rideshare Drivers United? Okay. Okay. Next question in the chat is from Maggie Green, who's the regulatory compliance manager with Hop Skip Drive. Maggie asks, because the reporting from TNCs seems quite lengthy and technical, will there be templates for reporting? Are there quote unquote experts TNCs can work with in developing the required plans to be reported through the Tier 3 advice letter?
So for the question on the templates, yes. So the plan is that staff will prepare data dictionaries as well as data templates for the data reporting requirements. In terms of the second part of the question on whether there are experts that can assist with this, I'm not exactly sure the answer to that. I'm not sure if Tara has more insight into that.
Yeah, maybe Maggie can clarify what you mean by experts. Certainly staff are available to provide procedural guidance on filing a Tier 3 advice letter and what the ultimate decision requires in that Tier 3 advice letter. So to the extent that's what you meant by experts, absolutely. If what you meant was more technical expertise on the types of strategies you might want to include, their effectiveness, or that type of advice, that's not something that staff is prepared to provide, but I don't foresee anything stopping TNCs from working with experts like that to develop their plans.
Okay, yes, and just to clarify that, I was asking kind of the second part of what you answered. Just I anticipate currently, I'm not sure if there's anyone within our company that would have that expertise to develop appropriate plans to really, meet those qualifications. Just because, it's a scientific and very technical process, which makes a lot of sense. But if you guys, and this may be something down the line, but had any people to refer to, I assume Carb could be a resource there for us in developing this. But if there were any sort of group or lists, we would definitely welcome any advice there.
Steph, do you foresee any of the working groups providing a venue for that type of discussion?
I don't foresee that right now, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't be, because I think that the driver working group will be a lot more driver focused. So if there were driver issues that come up that could be better investigated or understood, or to gather more information for those specific issues, that those might be informed by, say, the driver working group or other workshops. But the implementation working group, well, I guess there is an exception. If as the program implementation goes on, there might be strategies that seem to be working better or not. And maybe those would be issues to discuss in some of the working groups, but not, I think, in terms of helping to develop the plans. Maybe just to inform how things are going, at least as we've envisioned it so far.
Right. Okay. Great. Maggie says thank you. I have a couple of hands raised and another question in the chat. I'm trying to keep track of the order here. Next is Ashley Fillmore of Uber. Ashley?
Hi, yeah, my name is Ashley Fillmore. I'm a regulatory attorney at Uber. I just had a question. I think you touched on for the driver's assistance program that we could see more about the budget for that and everything in the proposal, which I did take a look at. I think it would help us to understand maybe a bit more, and correct me if I'm wrong, because there is a lot there. So it's totally possible I missed something. So it looks like the recommendation would be at least regulated entities contributing 11 million a year. And I noticed about 8 million of that was anticipated for administrative costs, with then more like 2 million going to driver incentives. I did get a chance to look at some of the other programs that CPUC cited too, but it looked like there it was more the inverse, which maybe is what I would have expected, where administrative costs were on the lower end and most of it was going toward incentives. And I think it would be helpful to just better understand a little bit about that, or if there's nuance there I'm not seeing.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think this is definitely a part of the proposal that, not that we don't want your feedback on all parts of the proposal, but here I think there is even a specific ruling, a question about particularly around the administrative costs for the driver's assistance program. So the way that it's written is, you're right, in the first 2 years, we propose $11 million coming from the CMS regulated entities to cover these administrative costs. But actually the 8 million that you referenced were for program administration. They didn't include, it doesn't specifically include the incentives, because we have not settled on the exact way to set the incentive amounts, and because we're expecting CMS regulated entities to propose how many drivers, low and moderate income drivers, I think they would like to transition and have access to those incentives. That value is still a question mark. So it's actually $8 million towards the program administration, and the incentive amount isn't specified. So feedback on whether that's an appropriate amount, whether it makes sense for the level of work, would be welcome. The other costs that are specified there are for the contracting agent, as well as funding the programmatic evaluation and the financial audit in the first 2 years for the rest of the program.
Got it. And then, so the 1.9 for early incentives, what is that sort of
Oh my goodness.
to apply to?
No, you're right. You're right.
Oh, no worries. I just
Right,
didn't know if that's like an undefined term or something to be.
No, you're right.
Okay.
I misremembered, and there was a bucketed amount of money, the 1.9 for incentives in the early years, but it's sort of it's a question mark on how much what that means in terms of how that will service the drivers or not, because the specific incentive amount isn't set. So it's a bucket of money, knowing that we would like incentives to be available to the low and moderate income drivers. But yeah, we welcome your feedback on the balance of that, those costs in your comments.
Okay, and just so I understand, so that's for the first 2 years, and it's sort of envisioned that the administrative cost could fluctuate or maybe go down over the future years, depending, you know, once it's up and running or something like that. It's not intended to be projected to the whole period.
So I would, so the cost for the program administration and for the programmatic evaluation of financial audit, I would assume would not be in the later years. There should be enough to cover it in the first 2 years. The program administrative costs, which are, I think, described as the terms are also similar, but the administrative costs of the program administrator, they could change over time. The way that's written, it's not assuming that it will. So if parties think that those costs should change over time, that they might be higher in the beginning and maybe they are lower at the end, or that what we proposed are not sufficient or overboard. I think those are all comments that we'd like to hear from you all.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Steph, let me just ask a clarification question as well. Would you say that it's I think Ashley raised this in her initial question as well, that generally in other programs, we see the administrative costs as a small fraction of the total costs of a program. And I think it's the expectation that we'll likely end up in a world like that. But what we're specifically looking for is feedback on how much it actually costs administrative wise to stand up a driver's assistance program like we described. And then secondarily, that the total amount available directly for incentives is a to be determined amount, because the proposal allows the TNCs to propose a fee and a total amount that they believe is necessary to meet the requirements of the program. Did I summarize that correctly?
Right. And yes, that's right. And I can see how that would be confusing in just reading it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everyone wasn't under the impression that we expected administrative costs to take 8 million of 11 million of an $11 million program. That's not the expectation.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Ashley, for your question. Next, we have a question in the chat, and then I'll come to Gabriel, who has his hand raised. So the question in the chat is from Mansi Katuria. When does CPUC expect to issue a phase 1 decision?
That's also a great question. So a phase 1 decision, so we have basically where we are now, we have the staff proposal out. We are expecting comments back on the staff proposal, the phase 1 staff proposal, January 30th. This is the new updated deadline. And then reply comments by the end of February. And then assuming that there is enough record for the proposed decision to be made, I think we estimate a timeline of around 90 days from the reply comments. But that could change depending on whether there is enough record or not. But that should give you some idea of when the first decision might come.
Great, thanks, Steph. All right, I will come next to Gabriel, and following Gabriel is Tom Birmingham.
Okay, my next question is, how can the definition for low and moderate income drivers be broadened to really encapsulate the financial hardship that a lot of these drivers face?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Is it that you would like that they are recommending that the definition be broader?
Yeah, it's like, is there other let me see, is there other ways that we can identify what's gonna determine somebody to be low to moderate income? Is it just how much they make? But my question is, can it be broadened up to really take in consideration what a lot of these workers actually end up taking home at the end of the day
Yeah,
after
so
off the
mhm.
offloaded costs that are
Yeah,
usually.
I think I guess there's like that question around what income is counting towards the income that is measured against the limit, right? So is it just income is it the take home that the drivers make? Is it all of the income that they make from any job that they do outside of driving? I think we're open to different ways of evaluating that part of it. The way that it's written in the proposal is individual driver income. So we've not said that it's based on household income of drivers because we want it to be very focused on the driver themselves. And we say annual income, so it's not specifically saying only from driving, but that could be an interpretation as well. So I think if we're open to kind of what is an appropriate way of setting that definition and in a way that is fair to drivers and captures, the real income from driving to make sure that drivers are supported as they transition to zero emission vehicles. So I think if parties have suggestions on what is a appropriate broader definition for driver income, we definitely welcome that feedback.
Great to hear.
All right. Thank you, Gabriel. Next, we have Tom Birmingham and then Molly Zimney. And then I'll come back to some questions coming in the chat.
Hello, I'm Tom Birmingham. I'm a driver here in Sacramento area, California. I guess, yeah, on the income, it seems to me on what I was thinking is, you had the two levels. You had the low income, then you had the moderate income. And if I'm understanding it right, that's 15% of that you would not allow them to go over that. So to me, the moderate income you're giving more money to is how I look at it, which might, no, I mean just the reverse. The low incomes you're having more money to, because the higher incomes will be having to spend more of their money. So, I mean, if I was a moderate income, I'd be thinking, oh, well, I'm going to have to spend more of my money to be getting, that 15%. That makes any sense.
No, I understand your question. And I think this is a challenge, I think, in trying to perfectly describe pretty complex proposals. But so for the incentive amount, particularly around the vehicle incentive, in the proposal, we describe a couple of different ways of looking at how you set an incentive amount that ensures minimal negative impact to low and moderate income drivers. And we propose this idea of affordability, which Carb has used in their vehicle incentives as well. And you reference that 15%, which is that, an individual shouldn't have to spend more than 15% of their total income on vehicle expenses in a year. And that's based on annual income. So the way that we had proposed was that there could be different ways that you would use that affordability concept to set the incentive amount. And it doesn't necessarily have to be based on those limits, other definitions that we've said, but that could be one way that you establish it. But I see your point in that if you are if you fall into the moderate but not low income driver, that 15% amount is bigger, as the actual value is bigger than for the low income. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it will be applied. That's one method of looking at it. You could also decide that, or we could also decide that it's applied driver to driver specific. Then your actual income would be accounted for and the percentage would be set in a certain way. But I think that comes with its own issues of being harder to implement if we're going to look driver to driver. So maybe there's some middle ground. I mean, the way that Carb did theirs, that they did the analysis and then picked a flat amount to apply to all drivers with more money set aside to low and moderate income drivers. So it could be that those limits, the definitional limits for low and moderate income drivers that we proposed are a way of kind of setting the stage, and maybe that actual incentive value would be a flat amount that's accounting for those differences between the low and moderate income, even though we group them together really when we're talking about low and moderate income drivers. They're really in the same bucket of they get access to the incentives and resources from the driver assistance program. So I understand why it's kind of it's not a super clear concept, and because we haven't exactly specified how it would work, just have put some ideas out there of how it could work.
Yeah, another thing on the income, so we, if you use the 55 cents a mile, I think it is, the Fed, our income is actually really kind of low. You probably know that because, let's say we make $20,000, from the trips, but we have 55 cents times, I'm just throwing out a number, but anyhow, it's like $10,000. So in all reality, you're only making $10,000. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that when you look at, when you start thinking about that annual income, at least from being a driver, a lot of it is deducted from the miles, so the income, as you start looking at it, needs to take that into account, I think. You probably know what I'm talking about because, yeah, on paper, we're making a lot less than, we actually are because of the big miles deduction, because we're putting on a lot of miles on our cars. And, it seems like cars now are more reliable. So, I mean, in the old days, you would be repairing your car, but now cars, like, I do the 55 cents because I'm almost spending nothing on other than oil and the oil change, for a year. So that 55 cents goes a long ways as far as deduction. Because if I just did the deduction on what I spent on actual repairs, it would be, very little. So that's just something to think about, when you're thinking about that annual income as far as a driver and their real expenses versus the 55 cents. Yeah. So
Thank
anyhow.
you. No, that's great. I think another thing occurred to me as you were talking again, but the definition for low and moderate income was purposefully set maybe higher than the actual income of most drivers because we wanted to be able to capture a good majority of the drivers. But in thinking about the affordability concept, it might be very different in that case, meaning that most of the drivers that maybe fall into our definition of low and moderate income are much on the lower end of that range. And so in applying the affordability concept, we might have to consider that more specifically and thinking about what an appropriate incentive would be. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
And then
Steph, I'll jump. Oh,
yeah.
sorry, Tom. Sorry,
just
Tom.
one
Can
more
I
thing.
interrupt you just for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to appreciate your comments and remind folks what we're really hoping to achieve right now is clarify the proposal. And the information you're sharing is really helpful feedback to provide either later in this session, in this workshop, and our open comment period, or ideally through the formal comment period itself. I think Steph has definitely acknowledged that we're looking for feedback on the whole thing, as you'll see from all the questions that were put out. But on the income threshold in particular, your insights are really valuable. So I just want to make sure everyone's clear. This portion right now, we're really trying to focus on your questions to make sure that everyone understands our intent in the proposal. We do have our next agenda item is what we intend to guide some questions to you as the audience and our major stakeholders. And then at the very end, there's a significant chunk of time for just open comment. So don't worry, we're trying to cover all the bases for you to provide feedback, but first we want to start with level setting everyone's understanding on the proposal itself. So I'm going to move us to the next comment I see, which is Molly Zimney. And let me just read off the order I've got coming up. So we have Molly. I've got a question in the chat from Susan Shaheen. And then we've got a couple other hands raised, Ashley Fillmore and Drew Cooper. So Molly.
Everyone, thank you. This is Molly Zimney, Regulatory Counsel at Lyft. And I had a question related to the reporting requirements from the CMS regulated entities. If I'm reading correctly, and please correct me if I'm misunderstanding, it looks like the proposal proposes that there be quarterly reporting from the CMS regulated entities, which would be more frequent than what we had previously been established as the annual reporting. That I think the first report would be early 2024. And I was curious what the timing for the first expected quarterly report, when that would be expected, given that we're not expecting a phase 1 decision until it sounds like the soonest June of 2023. And I asked partly just sort of to shape how you would answer. It's helpful for us to understand that, because understanding what the reporting requirements are informs how we collect that data to make sure that we can have that be complete and accurate.
Right. So we had added or proposed the quarterly reporting in the early years because we just want to make sure that we're tracking the program closely, that we're receiving the data that we're receiving can answer the questions and assessments, evaluations that we need to be tracking to make sure the program is on track as well. Which is why we were requiring the quarterly reporting, especially also around the fee. We wanted to make sure that we have good insight into what's being collected by the CMS regulated entities. The first quarterly report, I believe it's in the proposal, and I'll have to double check, as I think it's after there's like a certain amount of period. I'll have to double check, but it's stated in the proposal, there's a certain period of time before we expect the first quarterly report. But I need to double check. I don't want to say the wrong timeline, but it is in the proposal when that would start. It might be in the regulatory framework section.
Thanks. I will look into that further. Thanks.
All right. Our next question is in the chat from Susan Shaheen of UC Berkeley. She asks, will incentive support be differentiated between full and part-time drivers? What constitutes an eligible driver, for example, miles, hours, and or both?
Great question. I think it's not, in the proposal, staff acknowledges that there are eligibility requirements that should be part of the requirements for the access to incentives, in addition to the low and moderate income eligibility. I believe we shared some of the recommendations from previous workshops or comments from, I think it was Rideshare Drivers United, on how we could categorize eligible drivers. And I think we want to be fair to CMS regulated entities and to the drivers as well in terms of accessing the incentives, but It's not specifically stated what those are, but I would certainly highlight that as an area of feedback as well in terms of determining the appropriate eligibility requirements for drivers to access incentives. Those other additional ones outside of income.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's Susan.
Thanks, Susan.
All right. Next, I have Ashley Fillmore, then Drew Cooper, and then I have another question in the chat.
Sure. Just quickly returning to the low and moderate income driver definition, I did want to ask, was there a proposal for how to collect the data about who would meet those definitions, or is that something parties should propose? I wasn't sure if that was also something I know there was an annual survey mentioned, but my impression was that was for a different purpose.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different ways of looking at this from the data collection perspective. So we proposed the driver's assistance program that drivers who are accessing the resources and in particular incentives from the driver's assistance program, the program administrator would be collecting information on those drivers. But there is also an element of, actually I haven't mentioned it, but it's in the proposal in terms of protecting drivers from being deactivated or suspended from the platform. And for that requirement, this is all under the umbrella of ensuring minimum negative impact to low and moderate income drivers. Staff have proposed a kind of notice period where CMS regulated entities would have to provide notice to drivers, low and moderate income drivers who haven't converted to ZEVs, that before they are deactivated or suspended for that reason, that they're given the opportunity to access the driver's assistance program for, I believe it's a 120-day period. And then after that, they would also, if the CMS regulated entities, if the drivers have been given the opportunity to access the programs and they haven't, the CMS regulated entities will need to track those drivers that are being deactivated or suspended for that reason, for not converting to a zero emission vehicle. And in that case, it does rely on the CMS regulated entities knowing the income of the drivers to know which drivers are in the low and moderate income category and would need to be provided that notice, and also to have tracked that within the data.
Got it. So in the first instance, it would be the program administrator collecting that information.
Right. So there'll be a data collection through the program administrator once drivers have entered into the program and are being provided resources, and particularly the incentives. The program administrator will collect information on the drivers. But outside of that, to implement the notice requirement, it would require CMS regulated entities to have information about the drivers. Or, I mean, I guess on the other hand, the CMS regulated entities could say, we're going to give notice to all of our drivers, regardless of if they're low and moderate income. And that could be a solution as well. But those are I think the two main ones.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll go to Drew Cooper next. Drew.
Hi, thanks. Drew Cooper with SFCTA. My comment actually coincides with your response to the last question, particularly around this idea of deactivating drivers who don't have ZEVs, which, ZEVs are expensive and hard to afford, which is, I guess, the purpose of the incentive program. But so are you suggesting that deactivating these drivers is an appropriate step for TNCs to be taking? And how does that square with, or how will that be addressed by the goal to not harm low and middle income drivers? Because the amount of incentives on order of $2 million a year simply doesn't really seem like enough to ensure that these drivers are going to have access to those vehicles.
Yeah, I would I think that I confused everyone by implying that the $2 million was the set amount of incentive for drivers. That is not the intent. It could be a much larger amount. The purpose of protecting low and moderate income drivers, ensuring minimal negative impact, is a really important part of the implementation of the program. And providing, we have proposed this notice period because we want to encourage the CMS regulated entities to not deactivate and suspend drivers, and to help to get drivers to the resources that they need. If the CMS regulated entities are not giving notice and they're not providing adequate push for the drivers to get into the driver's assistance program, that's, I think, a signal to us that maybe that it's not working. Like, the intent is to convert drivers into zero emission vehicles with an appropriate incentive, like meaning that we're not going to push them into this. We're not encouraging or proposing that they're pushed into zero emission vehicles without incentives or sufficient coverage so that they are experiencing negative impact. But if the 100-day or 120-day notice period doesn't seem appropriate, or it seems like it's kind of giving the CMS regulated entities a path to deactivating or suspending drivers, that seems inappropriate. Definitely welcome your party's comments on that and things for us to consider on maybe different ways of looking at that issue. Tara, did you want to add anything?
I think mainly just to say, if it was interpreted that we were encouraging deactivation, that's not the case.
Right.
We are not. In fact, we're trying to protect drivers from that scenario and various other negative impacts of the implementation of this program. I hope that helps clarify, Drew. I will go on to another clarification question. Tom, who spoke earlier, did have one more clarification question in the chat, saying, I didn't understand the exemptions that were mentioned at the end of your presentation. I understand the wave, but not the 5 million miles. Steph, let me give you a break for a second. I think I can explain this one.
Thank you.
There are two exemptions from Carb's regulatory language. Tom mentioned both. One is the wheelchair accessible vehicle exemption, which exempts mileage from being counted that is associated with trips TNCs deliver in wheelchair accessible vehicles. The second, and I think the one Tom is looking for clarification on, is what is referred to as the small TNC exemption. And the threshold set by Carb there is 5 million miles. This means in order for a CMS regulated entity, for the clean mile standard to be applicable to an entity, they must have logged at least 5 million miles in that year for the CMS standard to apply. And the clarification that the staff proposal proposes is that in order to calculate that 5 million miles, we are looking at the entirety of period 1, 2, and 3 miles on that TNC's platform. So that means miles captured during the period in which drivers have the app on but have no trip requests. That's period 1. Period 2, the period between when a driver has accepted a trip and is on their way to pick up a passenger. And period 3, the period between it's actually the passenger service when a passenger is in the vehicle and being delivered to their destination. So it's a clarification on top of the exemption already adopted by the Air Resources Board.
Okay.
All right. So let me give people a second to gather your thoughts. I don't have any more hand raised or chat questions at the moment, and I think we're tracking about 25 minutes ahead of schedule. So we do still have time if there are other questions for clarification on the proposal. We give folks 20 seconds or so to think of that. If not, we can move on. All right, great. We do have a couple of others. Tom, I'll come to you, and then Carly.
So this is just a clarification. So the questions on that one document, that's, you want responses to every one of those questions? Is that what you're looking for what, January or February? And then you also want like a general comment on the whole proposal? Is it both, or I'm not quite clear what those dates mean, and if it applies to that one document, that's all the questions. Is there two things then, the comments on the entire and then answering all the questions?
So the comment due date that we mentioned earlier are for party comments. And so the comments could, and Tara can correct me if I'm wrong, so the comments could be just generally on the staff proposal, but we're also asking for specific comments on that list of questions, which are in the ruling document. But I believe that you have to be a party to provide comments through the official docket. And I think other ways for providing comment, I know there is like a public comment space within the docket to submit comments on the proceeding as well, that isn't necessarily linked to a specific ruling, but you could put comments, I think, on the staff proposal there, because Tara, will you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have to be a party to submit comments through the docket.
That's right. Members of the public that wish to make a comment on a particular proceeding, this is something we'd be happy to follow up with a little demo or show and tell after the fact if it's not clear. But there is a public commenting feature within our docket card, which is a online tool for logging public comments as well. So let's see. Okay. And you can always reach out to staff through the Clean Miles Standard email address, which is just cleanmiles@cpuc.ca.gov. Okay, thank you, Tom. Next we have Carly Markowitz.
Hello, Carly Markowitz with Rebel Tara, representing the California Integrated Travel Program. Just wanted to clarify, and I apologize if I'm getting confused with the setting of incentives, but can you confirm when you plan to set the incentive amounts? And is this one of the feedback mechanisms upon which you're going to be collecting that? Just the process by which you're going to formalize that and potential other programs that might be helping to fund those incentives as well?
Yes, if you have feedback on the incentive, I would encourage you to provide comments to the staff proposal. The way that it's kind of described in the staff proposal is we've proposed some methods, and we have a ruling question within the ruling doc specifically on that item. And that, I think, can help to inform where the commission takes that particular issue.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and I'll make one other note too, just because it was mentioned about filing comments on the docket. If anyone has a question about how to become a party, please reach out to us after the meeting. We can provide specific guidance on that. Okay. All right. I think we're good on clarification questions. Steph, let's move to the next agenda item.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my slides. I just have a couple of reminders. I mean, this is relevant, I guess, to what we were just talking about, but so everyone knows. Within the ruling questions for party comment, which we were just discussing, there is an attachment B, which includes summary bullets. It's still a 12-page document, but it's meant to be a more condensed version of what's in the staff proposal to help parties to kind of go between the ruling questions and the proposal itself. Maybe it's another resource for kind of making it through all of the ruling questions. So we encourage you to kind of use them together as you prepare your comments. And then just as another reminder, Judge Wong just extended the due date for comments. So they are now due at the end of January, opening comments due at the end of January, and reply comments due at on February 27th. And I do have a slide at the end of the presentation on becoming a party, and we can help with that also if folks have questions. Okay, so the next section we are calling staff-guided Q&A. Basically, I will present some additional details on a few issues that we hope will provide some clarification, or maybe they'll spur additional questions that you have that we can answer for you at this time, or will help to inform your opening comments. There'll be basically a few issues, and I'll pause to take questions after I go through them. I can go back and forth between the slides as well if you would like to take a closer look at them. And again, the slides will be available for you to view after the workshop, as well as the workshop recording. So if you wanted to reference the slides again, you could do so. For the periods where there are, I think I actually have some slides on this. This is basically the same slide. So if you want to comment when after each of the mini topics, we'll do the process in the same way, and Tara will help facilitate that as well. I think everyone's been doing great on raising hands, so I think we got the hang of it. Okay, so I'm going to start with the annual targets and timeline. Some of this may feel a little redundant, maybe we've already covered it, but just for clarity's sake, we'll go through the slides that I have. So these are the annual targets. They're pulled directly from the final regulation order that Carb prepared. Again, we have annual targets from 2023 to 2030, taking the final target 2030 down to 0 grams of CO2 per passenger mile traveled in the GHG target, and 90% EV&P or electric vehicle miles traveled for the second target. And I would just note that there is a gap between the 90% EV&P and the 0 grams of CO2 per passenger mile traveled. And so there is the option to include greenhouse gas credits for meeting the greenhouse gas emissions target. As I had stated before, but just for completeness, staff is proposing to hold the CMS regulated entities accountable to the two targets starting in 2023. Given that 2023 is upon us, we have asked that CMS regulated entities provide a status update on their progress to inform our and the Commission's understanding of where the CMS regulated entities stand now. And I included the slide because I hadn't included it in the summary bullet points, and just wanted to have a reference for the targets in case anyone had questions about them here. The next thing I wanted to cover in this section is a proposed implementation timeline, and we definitely have already had a few questions on what the initial months or years will look like for implementation here, and we understand that I understand there's a lot of detail in the staff proposal to kind of parse to figure out exactly what the timeline looks like. There is an Appendix A of the staff proposal, a timeline included. This is a slightly different version of it, just kind of looking year by year at the highlights. This timeline assumes a first decision in 2023, but as you will know, as you read the staff proposal, or if you're familiar with how the Commission works, many things come in series. And so depending on when that first decision is, could adjust the timeline shown here. So just know this is assuming a decision in 2023. I will highlight just a couple of things from each of them. It's really, this session is really just meant to get you thinking about the proposals and bring up any questions that you may have, or that you may have just from looking at the timeline itself. So after the first decision, what we're calling year one, there is the partial GHG plan submission, approximately 90 days after, or within 90 days of the first decision, to be submitted by the CMS regulated entities through the Tier 3 advice letter process. The fee collection would start for the CMS regulated entities after approval of the plans, and the RFP for the program administrator, which is allotted in the proposal 6-month process, start after submission of the plans, which is, I think, Ashley's question from previously, from the last session. In the second year, we're proposing that would include the selection of the program administrator, the submission of the program administrator's deliverables, the implementation plan and handbook. For year 3, we've highlighted the continued data reporting, the first annual low and moderate income driver impact report, as well as the start of RFPs for the evaluation contractor and financial auditor. In year 4, for this timeline, that would include the new GHG plan submission by the CMS regulated entities, first unanticipated barriers and progress report, as well as start of programmatic evaluation. And then in year 5 would be continued data reporting and the annual report again. That's also included in year 4. So these are all subject to change depending on the timing of decisions. There are other elements that aren't included in this timeline, things like the data reporting and greenhouse gas plans templates, the start of the working groups and timing for workshops. But this is just meant to give you kind of a different timeline view of what those first 5 years might look like. And I can go back to these slides if you want to get a closer look during the question time. So to get you thinking about the annual targets and proposed timeline, I have questions here, but you don't have to answer them specifically. If you have other questions that you've thought of or comments that you've thought of, as I presented the last few slides, we welcome you to share them. We're a little bit early on time, so we'll have to think about the timing, but we'll have a few minutes to take questions on these specific topics, and then we'll dive into the next. So it'll be kind of shorter Q&A sessions. So are there any questions on the annual targets or timelines? If you want to answer the questions on the slides, that's also welcome, but happy to answer your questions as well.
And Steph, while folks are thinking of that, I'm going to answer a question that just came in the chat. Will the slides be shared? Yes, we intend to post both the slides and the recording of today's workshop to our Clean Miles Standard webpage within a couple days after the workshop today. So that should be available for everyone's reference.
And I believe we did with the last workshop, but I will plan on sending links to those on the distribution list. So if you received an invitation to the workshop, then you should also receive a link later to the documents.
Okay, any questions on the targets and proposed implementation timeline, or feedback on the questions on the slide?
We can move on to, we have a bunch of other topics. So if folks think of questions as I'm going through the later topics, I'm also happy to answer those. We want to keep moving.
Looks like we can move on, Steph.
So the next mini section is on low and moderate income drivers, the driver's assistance program, and the program administrator. So some of you may not be as familiar with the third-party program administrator model, which we have proposed for the driver's assistance program. As mentioned, this is a common model used at the CPUC and by sister agencies like Carb and the California Energy Commission, and even for similar zero emission vehicle incentive programs like the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project through Carb. This model is useful because it provides a single source for resources across multiple regulated entities. It makes it easier for consumers to access the program materials and information resources. It leverages expertise in program administration and can allow for more effective outreach and engagement. So we propose this model, or staff proposed this model in the staff proposal in response to suggestions from labor groups and driver labor groups and drivers who suggested management of the driver's assistance program be conducted by a trusted entity like a third party. I have included on the slide the administrative costs, which I think we covered in the initial questions, but if there are any remaining questions around that, I'm happy to talk through them. And I included some links to other program examples. So again, if you access these slides after the workshop, you can click on these links to see how some other programs have implemented a third-party program administrator, both at CPUC as well as some of the sister agencies. I think Commissioner Sharma also mentioned the self-generation, and I'm not going to say it right. I know it's SGIP as another example of the third-party program administrator. I will keep going. And yeah, if you think of questions, feel free to put them in the chat, but we'll have another short question period as well. The other piece that I wanted to highlight is that the driver's assistance program is a big part of the implementation of CMS, and there are many entities who will have a role within the program. And we wanted to, after talking to other folks who had third-party program administrators and programs like this, they had recommended that the roles and responsibilities be very clear in terms of the different entities that are part of making the program a success. So within the staff proposal, there are a lot more details. I try to sort of simplify them for the slide just to demonstrate what entity will be responsible for what. But I think most important to highlight is that CPUC will have oversight over all parts of the driver's assistance program. Then the CMS regulated entities, the contracting agent, also a CMS regulated entity, but will be responsible for contracting with the program administrator. And then the program administrator itself will have their own roles and responsibilities within the driver's assistance program. And then there will, of course, be coordination across entities within the driver's assistance program implementation as well. And then one last slide, which I think that we've talked a bit about as well, but I thought deserved a highlight because the proposal is quite large, it's easy for some things to get buried. But the concept of the proposed incentive for both on the vehicle side, but also for charging, are included in the low and moderate income driver section of the staff proposal. And I've described in our previous session that the staff proposes a few different ways to think about how to set an appropriate incentive amount. And it's described in more detail in the staff proposal, and we actually talked about it a bit previously. So I just wanted to highlight that that's in there, that if, like Carly's question about getting input on the incentive amount, this is a great time to provide comments on that to staff, and also happy to answer questions about the way that we've proposed it and discuss it in the staff proposal. So those are some highlights. Again, I have questions. I don't feel that you have to answer them or not, but oh, Commissioner Sharma has a question. I did see that hand pop up.
I just raised my hand. Thank you, Stephanie. Very thorough presentation. I have a question for folks on the line, and this has to do with, in the staff proposal, it talks about purchase lease, or and is there any preliminary reactions to strengths or weaknesses of I mean, the staff is trying to be all-inclusive, not saying everyone has to purchase, but rather there could be lease or rental options. And a second question insofar as the responsibilities proposed for the regulated entities, contracting agent, program administrator, the CMS regulated entities. It says support program efforts. And does that include providing options for where a driver could say, well, what's going to best fit my needs? Is it the purchase? Is it rent, by the day or by the hour? Is it a lease option? And what does that mean to me, financially? And we will get to, well, what kind of incentive will we land on? But does anybody have any perspectives to add or to offer up at this point on strengths, weaknesses of purchasing, renting, or leasing? And if you don't, no worries, there's time.
Thanks, Commissioner, for that question. I did see a hand raised. Let me first go to Rideshare Drivers United and then Tom Birmingham. Nicole, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Nicole Moore here. When I tried to change my, to add Rideshare Drivers United, somehow it got rid of my name too. So Nicole Moore. So in terms of the purchase, we really don't have leases in the industry because the limits on mileage for people who lease is so low that most drivers go over those lease things. So people who are super part-time drivers might have leased cars, but full-time drivers who drive the majority of the miles in rideshare are either purchase or rentals, just for that. The other thing I think to be considered in this is that most of us are getting 5 or 6 year car notes if we're purchasing. And, so we've been considering the fact that drivers may have, I could buy a vehicle in 2025 and need to get out of that car note in order to buy a new one under a similar purchase plan, right? So I think when you think about purchasing, I think it's really important to think about how do you also make sure that people aren't carrying a car note for a car that they can no longer use. So that is my feedback on that. Rental is very much a reality for a lot of drivers. We rent both through the companies, which you guys should know also impacts our income. They usually pay us less if we rent through them. And then there are also a lot of, boutique rentals that rent to rideshare drivers as well. So, there's both through the companies and not through the companies.
Thank you, Nicole.
Yes, thank you. Next, we have Tom Birmingham, and then I have a couple questions in the chat. Tom?
Yeah, so this is where I spent most of my time in the proposal is, from a driver's viewpoint, does it make economic sense? I mean, that's the question. And I looked at it from the low income. So that means, if I understood it, that was $165 of the $57,000. And then anything above that, if I understood the 15%, you would kick in as the incentive to make up for the rental, lease or purchase. So I just looked at it from, and I kind of poked around a little bit about buying one or leasing one. But I'm mainly focused on what Uber's currently doing, the 334 plus taxes and whatever fees. So I figured $350 and 165, I think you'd make up that $200 difference to make the 350 from 165 to 350. So it's kind of close actually for what I see, because I spend about $200 on gas a week. So it's kind of close as far as the impact. It's kind of spot on if I'm understanding it correctly. And then you have the incentives of charging, which well, that's just more money. So to me, it's kind of close, at least for the low income, driver assistance program. So yeah, just to recap, 57,000, 15% is 165. The Uber rental program is 350. So, it would be, making up that $200 for the 330, for the 350. And then I'm spending gas of 200. So it's pretty close of the incentive.
You're saying pretty close between purchase and renting?
No, I'm just looking at it from just the Uber rental thing. It's right now, if I go out today and rent an Uber Tesla, it costs $334 plus taxes and fees, which I have no idea what the taxes and fees are. But I'm assuming that's
Is that per week? Is that for a week or?
That's per week, yes. Yeah, that's per week. So I'm assuming the fees and taxes are probably $16. I could be wrong. So that's, for me to rent a Tesla a week is $350. And so it's kind of hard to determine how much the charging costs. I have no idea on that, on the cost. I mean, gas is coming down now, so I mean, if we had this discussion, 6 months ago, I was spending probably more like $300 a week on gas versus the 200.
Yeah.
So I mean, as far as me, renting, leasing, or purchasing, yeah, it's like the person right before me talked. I really don't want a car payment. I have my current car paid off. But I mean, if you could get a car payment, well, I mean, even the car payment, I mean, to me, the leasing thing of 350 is way out of line. I mean, I think my guess is the only ones that are doing that are ones that don't have a car. So, they're going ahead because it's easy to get into a car and start making money. But maybe the purchase option could maybe make sense. I mean, if you could, 350 times 4 is what, $1,500, give or take. So that's a lot of expense just to make up that rental payment. So if I was encouraged to do the zero emissions, it'd probably be better to buy a car, because it's certainly not going to be $1,500 a month.
Hey, thank you, Tom, for your insights. It's certainly, highlights the importance of the whole cost benefit analysis for each of these categories. So thank you. Back to you, Tara. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. First is from Andrew Martinez. I think from Carb, who asks, what did you mean by match CVRP for charging costs? CVRP does not have a provision for charging costs as far as I know.
Yeah, I think they just added it. So I think it's part of the new funding for the, I'm probably going to get the program name wrong, but the program that funds the CVRP, I believe they just added the an additional incentive that is basically a charging card to provide, I think when I last read it, it was $1,000 worth of charging credit to go along with the vehicle incentive. And I believe that did get approved by the board. So in that case, the reference to the match CVRP is in reference to that new charging credit card. I think that's how they described it. But they, I think, was just approved.
Got it. I know we do have some Carb stuff on the workshop call. If anybody knows, perhaps you can provide that clarification in the chat about CVRP.
And the acronym, if someone could spell that acronym.
CVRP.
Yeah, Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. I always call it program, but I believe it's actually project. So Clean Vehicle Rebate Project.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for that clarification. Next question is from Ashley Fillmore of Uber, who asks, is there a process for selecting the contracting agents?
So similar to other programs at the CPUC, the commission typically assigns the contracting agent as one of the regulated entities.
Okay. Next question is from John Van Geffen, who asks, has there been any consideration of how EV dealers and manufacturers can be a part of the discussion, considering they would directly and financially benefit from the proposed driver assistance program?
So there's nothing in the proposal that's specific to that particular issue, but the CMS regulated entities can create their own partnerships or programs to supplement the driver's assistance program, or maybe it becomes incorporated into it. But there are ways in which they can propose actions to get them to meeting their annual targets. That might be something like that, partnerships or dealerships. And maybe that then gets wrapped into the driver's assistance program if it's something that is applicable. But there's nothing specifically on that as a requirement in the staff proposal.
Okay. And I see there's a little bit of back and forth about some of the comments that were just made in the chat. I'm not going to read them out loud here, but I'm going to ask our note taker to make sure those are captured in our notes so we can refer back to them later. Any other questions or comments on this section of the presentation? Okay, I see one more hand. Ashley?
Hi, yeah, I did just want to ask clarity on one other thing. I know one of the proposed incentives related to financial incentives for charging and time spent charging. I wasn't sure if there was a proposal for how time spent driving would be allocatable to the charging time and costs, or if the commission wanted parties to include proposals for how that would be calculated.
Yeah, there are no details on that in the proposal. I think just in the proposed methods for the three proposed methods, like Carb used an approach to calculating it. So there'd have to be an assumption on how that would be accounted for, but it's not specific. So if you have recommendations or comments on that, yeah, please do include that.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have one other hand raised. Ralph Trout from CalSTAR.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to talk about the charging incentive to cover cost of charging and other related costs. Does that include the infrastructure, like a level 2 EDSE?
So not as proposed in the staff proposal, although I believe we did add a ruling question around charging infrastructure because we hadn't, staff hadn't proposed anything specific around charging infrastructure incentives. I think initially we had envisioned that they would work, the driver's assistance program administrator, CMS regulated entities would work with existing incentives. But if there's a need for specific incentives around charging infrastructures for CMS, that's something that we definitely want to hear more about. And if it's critical to the success of the program, then that's something for us to consider. So it's not specifically in there, but there is in the proposal itself, but there is a question in the ruling questions around whether that should be considered.
Okay, I see no more questions on this topic. Let's move on.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I have 2 or 3 other short topics. And the first is on clean mobility, environmental, social justice, and outreach and engagement. Here, we have found typically less engagement on these issues from parties, and we want to provide an opportunity for other stakeholders and participants to see what we have proposed, to engage with us if there are any questions or feedback to provide. So I'll have a couple of slides where I just kind of reiterate what's in the proposal, just to get us thinking about it again. So for clean mobility and environmental and social justice policies, if you recall, or focus on, the focus for CMS is on getting low and moderate income individuals, in other words, drivers, into zero emission vehicles, and to providing low and moderate income communities with more access to rides in zero emission vehicles, as well as with increased access to EV charging. The definitions that we proposed for low and moderate income individuals and communities are California specific and income based. And if you recall, CMS regulated entities will describe in their greenhouse gas emissions plans how their proposals will support the goals of clean mobility, as well as the environmental and social justice action goals, with required data reporting and assessment through the biennial unanticipated barriers and progress report. And then in terms of proposed outreach and engagement, this really is just a repeat of what's in the summary slides, but basically there are 2 main components. A big one is focused on drivers, and that's from the CPUC's proposed driver working group, the annual driver survey, as well as outreach and engagement that will be conducted by the CMS regulated entities and the driver's assistance program. And for CMS regulated entities, that will be part of their proposal and their greenhouse gas plan. For the driver's assistance program and the program administrator, that will be a part of the implementation plan that they submit to CPUC. And for the other orgs, there's the implementation working group, also the transportation and electrification workshops, and outreach as part of the driver's assistance program, as well on the program administrator. So there are a few questions on these slides. Again, Commissioner, if you have questions that you would like to ask, we welcome those to be shared also. But if we do have folks on the line who are active in the clean mobility or environmental and social justice space, and you have questions on what we proposed or comments on how we track progress made towards these goals, the kind of data reporting we're proposing, we would definitely welcome your feedback here or through comments or party comments to the proposal as well.
Steph, I have one question in the chat so far. Will the outreach and engagement plan be comprehensive enough to bring in immigrant and monolingual communities?
That's a great
This is
question.
from Gabriel, Gig Workers Rising.
So the outreach and so for the driver's assistance program and the program administrators required deliverables to CPUC, including the implementation plan, has a specific section on outreach and engagement and includes specifics, I think, on language support, but I'm not sure that it has anything specific on immigrant support, but that's a great, I think, comment and something to consider, and would encourage that feedback in a party comment as well, and making sure that we're comprehensive and thinking about the, all of the needs and challenges that drivers might face.
Any other questions or comments? Gabriel says thanks. Great. Yes, Commissioner Sharma.
So in our environmental social justice action plan, there are 9 goals, and the staff proposal is that the TNCs look through these goals, assess them, determine if there are actions to be taken, and much more. It's all there in the staff proposal. Now, one of the goals is it's goal number 7, and it says promote high road career paths and economic opportunity for residents of ESJ communities. And it says maximize authority to promote a high road, educate on high road careers, partner with utilities and sister agencies. Now, a lot of that is geared towards the CPUC itself, but for those drivers that are residents of ESJ communities, maybe this is not so much of a question, but to be answered now, but to determine, is there a role for the TNCs to weigh in on career paths and economic opportunity for drivers who are residents of ESJ communities? I don't know precisely what that roadmap would be, but I'm just pointing out that is one of the 9 goals, one of the 9 goals. So I really advise that folks, become well-versed in what those 9 goals are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'm just waiting to see if anyone wants to chime in on that point.
I mean, yeah, I could.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the commissioner knows this, but Uber, if you're a given level of an Uber driver, they do provide, I think it's the Arizona state, they provide for your education to get a degree. I think it's Arizona State online, but you have to be a certain level of driver. So there's already kind of an incentive for, people to drive and then get that, benefit or whatever. Yeah, I think you might have to be at the top, the Uber Pro, to get the incentive of the free education. That's Uber. I don't know about any other ones like Lyft, or this is just the Uber Uber program.
Good to know, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Steph, were there any of these four that you wanted to highlight to seek comments?
I think I'm curious of the way, like making sure that we can adequately track progress made towards the goals, I think will be important. And if there are methods for data collection or methods for analysis that we should consider to make sure that it is an effective analysis and that we're collecting the right data. I'm definitely curious about that, whether here or in the comments the parties make. I think that would be helpful. But it does look like we have another question or hand raised.
Yes, and there was actually a comment that came in from Alvaro on the last point Tom was making. So I'll read that out. Alvaro is suggesting that in the program Tom was describing, they only had 300 open spaces that filled up really quickly. He says after 30 minutes. So yeah, I think obviously there's some that it would be beneficial from the TNCs who run these programs to get a better understanding of which drivers are offered which benefits along the lines of the comment that the commissioner was making. I will go to raised hand Ralph from CalSTART again, and then I have another question in the chat.
To address the environmental justice opportunities, the program I'm working on at CalSTART is known as Energize, and I also support Communities in Charge and also a Carb program known as HFIP. And one of the things we're having significant issue with is educational outreach, engagement, workforce development. We were working with the GoBiz office and we found out our marketing, advertising, outreach just wasn't there. Environmental justice to tribe, low-income DAC, LIC areas has to be completely redesigned because of the social media outlets that they primarily focus on. So your CMS activity as it pertains to these electric vehicle charging systems and outreach is going to have to completely rethink. And I suggest that the CPUC talk to the GoBiz office with regards to lessons learned, and with the Carb and the Energy Commission on the two programs we're currently working on and trying to redesign to better reach those equity targets. One of the things we haven't talked about here that's briefly discussed is workforce development. Once these electric vehicles get out there, there's going to need to be service techs. There aren't any. The other issue is going to be electric vehicle charging. Once they're installed to the programs I'm administering and they're up and running, they're eventually going to need to be serviced. There's nobody to service them. There is no educational programs in the state of California that we are aware of that can address this deficiency in training requirements where we could have staff to draw upon for the purposes of, one, maintaining the vehicles, two, maintaining the infrastructure. So we've got to develop a program, and then that we get into the problem with regards to not the training staff. Who are the training staff? Who's going to teach the training staff? And then what is the accreditation process within the state of California? Is it going to be a DeVry type education, a community college type education, a senior high school program where you focus on STEM and technology? I really appreciate everything you guys are doing with regards to moving the clean vehicles into space, but we're not addressing the issues that are going to come up very shortly after we start having a sufficient quantity of vehicles on the road, which would be again, the workforce development, maintenance, and preventive maintenance, and as well as the staff to do all that work. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ralph. We have another question in the chat from Susan Shaheen from UC Berkeley, who asks, or who says, charging availability in multifamily housing is a concern. Will real estate partners, for example, apartment complexes, be engaged in the outreach and engagement?
There's nothing specific about that. We do know that it's a big concern, particularly for the driver population, and I think should be a part of the outreach and engagement, particularly around the charging infrastructure. In the proposal, it's a bit envisioned as the program administrator as the resource and the driver's assistance program as a resource for drivers would be all encompassing in that way. So they would be providing the incentives, but also as a resource to connect drivers and others who might support drivers, like in the case of getting charging into multi-family unit dwellings, that would go through the driver's assistance program. But it's also possible that there will be efforts by the CMS regulated entities pushing for assistance for getting charging infrastructure into multi-family unit dwellings. I know it's also a big part of the transportation electrification framework from the CPUC and the electric utilities that re-regulate. The decision that was just approved last month. So I envision that will be a big part of it, but the proposal is not very specific on what that would look like.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephanie. And Nicole from RDU also mentioned that this is going to be potentially a problem in single family homes that are being rented because they might not have the ability to install chargers or have that permission. So I'm not sure how those individuals or entities would be contacted and engaged.
The proposal kind of envisions a driver's assistance program as this, as I said, like all-encompassing resource. So if a driver were to approach the program administrator to get resources on what they would need to do to transition to a ZEV, it wouldn't just be support for procuring a ZEV and understanding the finances, but also on what their living situation is and what charging would look like for them as well. So I think those are the types of details that we are proposing are supported through the driver's assistance program, but noted that it's not just a multifamily unit housing issue. It could be broader than that.
Great. Delighted to hear you're thinking that through, Stephanie.
Thanks, Susan.
I see, one more hand raised, Adam Grimace from Uber.
Thanks, Tara, and thanks, Stephanie. And let me just say that I so appreciate the Commission's very comprehensive focus on this issue. It's certainly one that is of great importance to us, and what we're finding already, that drivers who use EVs, who use our app, are overrepresenting communities that are not represented in the general population who are using EVs. Overrepresentation of lower income communities, frontline communities. So we so appreciate this, because if we get this right, the opportunity is to move so many working people to the front of the clean energy transition line to be ambassadors for EVs in their communities. So I think this is really a huge opportunity. I'm curious to hear how the Commission is considering level of participation in the assistance program, and in this portion of the program as it relates to ESJ. And what I mean by that is, because we see such variation in participation, we have drivers that have been on the app for years and consistently year after year are looking to do many hours per week. And then there's some that are very seasonal, that might come for a few months at a time and then leave for the rest of the year. And then there are some that might do just a few hours in a given week and then never to be seen again. And how is the Commission thinking through levels of participation by drivers using apps in the industry as a component or a consideration for these programs?
So I would say that we're open to feedback on what is the appropriate way of, especially around how you provide incentives, the incentive piece of it, like who gets the incentives outside of just the income requirements. There are these other eligibility requirements that we can consider. And we had some suggestions in the staff proposal on what those could be, whether you're looking at like full-time or half-time or drivers that have been on the platform for more than 6 months, something like that. But if there are other ways of thinking about or other characteristics of a driver that parties think are important to consider, I think that would be helpful. I think in terms of outreach, that might also impact what the plans are, meaning that if you only do outreach at certain times of year, you might not capture all of the drivers that you could, or maybe, I don't know, maybe you have special pushes at certain times of the year because there are more drivers. It's kind of like we don't have all of the information on drivers to know what's best. So if there are suggestions on good ways of thinking about that or looking at that, I think that would be really helpful in just understanding the bigger picture.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
All right. I don't see any other hands raised or questions in the chat. You want to move on, Steph?
Yeah, I think we're actually like right on time. I think we were right on time from where we were, so it's great. And I thank everyone for their questions. So I have just one more mini topic before we get to the open comment period. And there's not that much that I had prepared to say on this topic. I mainly just wanted to put up a slide of some of the elements of the greenhouse gas plans. Like the driver's assistance program, the greenhouse gas plans are a big part of CMS implementation, right? This is how CMS regulated entities will describe to Commission and publicly their plans for meeting the annual targets. And in the staff proposal, there are a lot of details around both the process for submitting plans, what the plans will include, how they'll be reviewed. And I wanted to make sure there was an opportunity for folks to ask those questions about the plans if there are things that are confusing. Also, just to emphasize that this is a big part of the program and make sure that parties are paying attention to the details there as well. So that's it. I don't have any questions on the slide, just an opportunity for GHG plan questions. And this is the last of the mini topics. So we'll have the open comment period after this.
Okay, I see one hand from Cindy Reyes.
Hi, hopefully this is a pretty quick question, but I'm just wondering about these tier 3, tier 1, 2, 3. Are these coming from these came out of the proposal, or is this kind of terminology that the CPUC already uses? Just wondering about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It is CPUC specific terminology, and there's a section, I believe it's in the regulatory, the regulatory section of the proposal that describes them. But basically, it's the tiered process. The different tiers require different levels of review. So a tier 3, which is what is required for the greenhouse gas initial plan submissions, requires resolution through the Commission. Tier 1 and tier 2 don't. So depending on what we thought was the appropriate level of review and approval, we proposed the different tiers. And you can, I think there's reference to, there's a link to the general order that describes the tiers as well. So if you wanted to get a bit more, if you wanted to dive into the details of the tiered advice letters, I can't remember the general order number. Tara might have it off the top of her head.
Yeah, it is 96B, and I was just about to paste a link in the chat to where you can get access to that document.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, and Molly has a hand raised.
I think you're on mute, Molly.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I had a question about the scorecard. I'm wondering, and I apologize if this is in the plan, but if we had an indication of the timing or what stage at which we could expect to see the scorecard, and if that would be part of a decision or something in which parties would be able to comment on the scorecard itself.
So I'm not sure if I will, Tara, I would ask you to correct me if I am wrong, but the scorecard would be part of the phase 1 decision in terms of like what that would include. I don't know if, and I believe in the proposal, it doesn't include a like a template for the scorecard, but it includes a template for the plans, which I think will help to maybe connect to how things will be reviewed, because in the proposal it describes like an assessment per section of the, I don't know if the exact word is section, but something like that, like element of the full greenhouse gas plan. So I would envision that the template for the plans would describe the groups of sections that would be basically assessed with the scorecard system, if that makes sense. So how those would be grouped could be given the evaluation that sufficient, adequate, I don't know. My brain is jumbled, but the 3 categories that we have for the scorecard would be applied in that way.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Molly.
All right, any other questions on this piece before we move into an open comment period? Okay, seeing none, let's move on.
Great. So we'll basically run this open comment period like we have the questions. So if you have a comment that you would like to provide, Tara will help facilitate giving everyone an opportunity. Just keep in mind that we want everyone who would like to provide a comment to have an opportunity. So we request that you try to keep it brief if you can. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Tara to help facilitate that.
Great. All right, I see 2 hands. Nicole Moore from Rideshare Drivers United, and then Gabriel Cardenas from Gig Workers Rising.
Am I on mute? Or am I'm unmuted. Okay, very good. I have some prepared comments. My name is Nicole Moore. I'm the president of Rideshare Drivers United. I'm a part-time driver, and I've been working with our organization and 20,000 drivers around the state. I'm speaking on behalf of our labor and environmental coalition that's come together around these particular issues. That includes us as well as SEIU, the Blue Green Alliance, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the Sierra Club. I just I wanted to bring into close focus is to understand where drivers are right now. We have just completed a study, and after expenses and benefits that come out of our pockets, we found that drivers are netting about $6.20 an hour for all of their time driving with their app on. We net about 75% of what we bring home, and what we bring home is less than 50% of what passengers pay. Sometimes we've seen it where we're getting less than 20% of what passengers pay. So we don't get paid for our wait time. So you could be working for a 10-hour shift, and if you only get 4 rides, that's all you get paid for is those 4 rides. For the record, paying for this conversion should not be something that drivers should pay, but certainly we also are very aware of the fact that passengers are paying very high prices right now. And The other thing you should know is that drivers understand how important this change is for our planet and for our kids. We want to be able to be part of the solution, but we can't do it without substantial financial help given this overlay. We're not protected by laws that apply to other workers because of Prop 22. And despite the fact that we are truly not building our own businesses, and we're controlled by algorithms that are written by the companies. So the first thing we want to say is that our coalition strongly supports critical important points that have been made in this proposal. So creation of a driver's assistance fund paid for by the TNCs and independently managed. We support using the fund money for the ZEV lease, rental, purchase, and charging. We support the use of funds to plus up existing state, federal, and local incentive programs. And we support the driver working group, which we see as a very important aspect to implementing this over the long term. The annual driver survey on driver equity impacts we support, as well as the CPUC compensating drivers for CMS work group participation, because we found it's very difficult for drivers to participate like this without compensating them. So we have also concerns about it. I just want to bring into focus that without serious help for drivers and real authority and enforcement by government, and excellent planning and policy decisions, Rideshare's conversion to an all-electric fleet could represent a mass firing of tens of thousands of drivers, with many passengers also left at the side of the road without transportation that they've come to depend on. So at a high level, our coalition of labor and environmental organization has concerns with following things. We want to make sure that that is not the future that we're writing. First and foremost, we think that the proposal gives way too much authority to the companies to regulate themselves. We found that doesn't work. That's what Prop 22 is. So in this proposal, the regulated industry gets to design a tax upon itself. The TNCs get to decide the overall funding level required in the overall structure of the incentive program. Instead, the PUC, we believe, should control the fee and program structure so that the public has faith that CMS environmental and work goals are met in a timely manner and equitably for drivers. So in designing a fee, the CPUC consider that the companies are already collecting $1 for each electric ride provided by the service. The amount that the companies should be paying into the fund should be at least $1 a ride. Without access to determinative data that can calculate a number, that is a good place to start. The CPUC should set a fee based on thorough company data reporting and policy goals, and set up goals that must be met around electrifying the fleet. Otherwise, you know, you just have to imagine what these numbers are. We really need to be able to calculate them. To summarize, the proposal is giving too much autonomy to the companies to regulate themselves. Funding level, fee, incentive structure, that's not okay. We believe that you have shown leadership and can lead on this. The second piece of feedback is around fee design. The fee should be designed in such a way that the PUC can adjust it as necessary to achieve the funding level necessary to achieve CMS policy goals. You should be able to reset fees on a regular basis to ensure adequate incentive funds are available to achieve CMS policy goals without the burdens to drivers. I mean, in our discussions, there's just so much that's shifting right now. You know, if I have 3 years left on my car note and it's time for me to convert to electric. Is there even a market for a gas vehicle anymore? We don't know what it's going to look like. So there has to be the ability for you guys to change the number based on the data that you're getting. And that brings me to the next thing, which is data reporting. Strong data reporting will be needed for CPUC to accurately determine the fee. And I think it has to come from the TNCs. They have mountains of data, and you know, it has to be clear, super granular data, you know, that you guys have to get from the companies. And I think it's not just the data of what's happened in the past, but I think as a regulatory agency, you need to understand the corporate plans and market predictions that they're operating out of in order to understand how a fee will likely impact operations, and of course the goals that you guys are setting for this program. So the next section is around passenger burden. I'm going to say it again. It goes without saying that drivers can't be paying for this additional transition, but it's also very important to ensure that the fee doesn't fall on passengers either. Their prices have doubled and tripled over the last year and a half, and it's been very difficult for passengers. The issue is that the companies take a lot more of the fares than they used to. So in terms of a transition plan, the proposed decision for the first time considers policy around deactivations and phase outs. These need to be much more thoughtful, equitable, and stronger. Number one, in the proposal, 120 days advance notice required for deactivation. That is entirely too short. Even a year too short. 5 or 6 year car loans, we need 5 or 6 years notice so that we can make the right decisions going into this. I feel like today we should be sending drivers notice that this is a policy requirement in California and that things are being set up, you know, to help drivers transition, and it should come from California. Right now, the companies are taking, Uber has taken credit for, you know, we're going to be an all-electric fleet by 2030. And I think it's really important for drivers to know that the state is backing this transition and to help with it. The overarching request is that the PUC needs to create a much more thorough plan for equitable deactivation and pairing that with incentives that mean that nobody would have to be deactivated unless they want to leave the business. 6 years notice with the goal that every driver relying on TNC income will be helped into an EV without raising their total driving cost. That's got to be our North Star. People who primarily rely on TNCs for income, for DAF funds, should be prioritized for incentives if they are slated for deactivation. Long-term car loans, 120 days doesn't work. In general, we should not be recommending deactivation. CPUC should pressure companies to put drivers into EVs at no increased cost to drivers. Let's see. Right now, I mean, just so we have experience with this, because right now our cars age out at 12 years or 15 years. I guess I just think it was just moved to 15. So there's constantly an aging out, but this would represent the entire force being aged out at the same time, except for those in EVs. So for the state to tackle this, while we're moving in the right direction, much more has to be done to design the fee, the program structure, and the phase-out plans fairly and equitably. Fundamentally, the PUC needs to take an even strong role in guiding the process, and we are absolutely behind you in doing that. We plan to elaborate on these comments and written comments in the near future, but we wanted to give you our initial take on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I have one other hand raised, Gabriel from Gig Workers Rising.
Also have a prep statement. My name is Gabriel Cardenas. I'm an organizer with Gig Workers Rising, and also I used to work as a rideshare driver full-time for 2 years with 5,000 rides under my belt. Very proud of that. Gig Workers Rising has been representing app-based drivers in California since 2018 for better wages, working conditions, and respect on the job. Thousands of rideshare drivers have taken action with us for dignity and respect on the job. We support the goals of the Clean Mile Standard, and we appreciate the work of the Commission in ensuring there is a program for drivers to help manage this transition. We do have a concern that the proposed regulations give a great deal of leeway to TNCs in terms of selecting the driver assistance program administrator, proposing a cap on how many drivers can be deactivated or deprioritized, and setting their own fees to fund the program. We appreciate that the Commission intends to retain oversight of these functions and require regular reports from TNCs. We believe it is important to share the Commission's findings with stakeholders like driver groups to ensure this transition is handled fairly, and we look forward to working with you on the implementation of this transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I don't see any other hands raised at the moment. I do have one chat comment, which I'll read out from Mark Gruberg. I believe, Mark, you're from the San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance. If you can confirm that in the chat, just so this is, okay, great. He says yes. Mark says, I think there should be substantial incentives for vehicle purchase, but I don't understand the rationale for incentivizing charging costs. The costs of purchase and installation of second-level chargers is justifiable, but EV charging is generally cheaper than comparable gas costs. I believe these incentives would be better applied to vehicle acquisition. I'm also skeptical about incentivizing vehicle rental, which might only serve to drive up rental costs. Thank you for that comment, Mark. We have one other hand from Mansi.
Yeah, hi, my name is Mansi. I am the Associate Director of Health and Care Policy with Working Partnerships USA, and I'm concerned about how the income brackets are based on state level income. So Working Partnerships is based in San Jose, which is currently the most expensive city in the country to live in. And I think there should be a consideration of regional area median income and housing costs that affect total cost of living that are calculated into those buckets.
Great, thank you for your comment. Tom Birmingham next.
Yeah, you know, when I first started reading your document, and I do want to also say that it's very extensive and it's very complex issue. But you guys have really addressed a lot of, I mean, I don't think you haven't touched on any single category. I guess when I first started reading, I saw minimal, and being a driver, that was kind of a, you might say, a negative thing. I mean, I think the word, I mean, if you like had bullet points with other drivers and you said, well, you know, minimally impact them, that's going to be just right out of the chute a negative thing, because as everybody's stating, it's a tough business. The margins are very small, and to me, it would have been a nice word to say, meet or exceed what you're currently making. Because you are like the previous two people, the gig workers and the rideshare people. Obviously this is a minimal business to begin with, and if you say you're gonna make it even worse, it's kind of like, oh no, I don't want anything to do with this. And I think, the comments on the other gig workers, United and stuff, I mean, the Prop 22 really wasn't addressed in the document. I mean, that is, I don't see it was mentioned at all, actually, when I read it, unless I missed it. But that's the minimum wage. We're supposed to be 125% of minimum wage. So that, obviously that should be met. And to me, to use the word incentive, we were kind of in partnership this together, and we got to figure out, not to lose any money, and maybe to even make a little more money, because we're all in this together. Anyhow, that's what I'm thinking, is to make it as positive as possible for us drivers.
Thank you, Tom. I don't have any other hands raised at the moment. I also just want to appreciate that pretty much everyone who's commented so far has highlighted components of the proposal that work for them as well as those that don't. So either of those pieces are really helpful feedback. I'll just pause for 30 seconds. Yes, Adam.
Thanks, Tara. Appreciate the comments that have been made. I'm curious to hear more from staff about what drove your decision around looking at the driver assistance program through the lens of the SOMA solar for multifamily housing program, and where you thought the strongest comparisons were. I'm curious to know if you looked at other, say, fleet programs where fees are being raised for drivers to help them with various needs, whatever they might be, particularly for vehicle turnover, and if you looked at models from other jurisdictions outside California, for instance. And lastly, I was struck by the amount of conversation in the draft proposal around administrative costs and around what the administration of such a fund would require. I wondered, I was hoping, and I imagine you share these, but I didn't see them reflected in the draft proposals, but the aim here is to maximize the benefit and the amount of funding that drivers can access, while minimizing administrative costs and minimizing any friction for drivers to access those funds. And I just want to double check that is staff's intention, and that's the direction that we could be thinking of.
I can respond to Adam's questions. SOMA was an example because it's part of the CPUC where they had a program administrator. So really, we wanted to highlight another program at the CPUC that used a third-party program administrator. And there are other examples. We looked at the Carb, CVRP, and other vehicle rebate programs as well, just to understand how they worked with third-party program administrators and how they estimated costs for the program, challenges that they faced, and things that they thought we should think about in starting up a program, kind of lessons learned from them as well. In terms of the budgeting, yes, the primary purpose of the driver's assistance program is to ensure that drivers are supported in their transition. The program should be well supported enough to make that effective. And whether that amount is what's proposed in our staff proposal or whether that's a different amount, we're open to comments on what's appropriate for what's proposed within the program and what we're all trying to achieve with the program. So thank you for the comments.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, maybe point it back to you, Adam, to the extent that you have other examples that you recommend we look at, or that maybe are more analogous than the examples Steph cited. We'd be interested in that comment here or otherwise.
That's great, Terry. Yeah, we'll take a hard look at that. And, I want to be looking for models that have been shown to work in other jurisdictions, maximum payouts to drivers, maximum results of actual transition to clean energy solutions. So we'll be looking at that and share your interest.
Just wait patiently for a little bit here, see if anyone else has a comment. We have about 15 minutes left, so we do have plenty of time.
I've got another question for you. I don't want to take up unallocated time, but I wondered if staff had considered, are there any natural connections with ACC2, being Carb's recently passed major package, driving EV supply in the state, also with lots of great provisions around supporting the used EV market, which is going to be so critical for so many drivers who use our app to make an affordable transition. There's also a few community uses of EV provisions in ACC2, not specific to rideshare or anything like that, but just broader ideas around EJ communities' access to EVs that go beyond just straight ownership. And I wondered if there have been any connections with Carb to think through, are there nice synergies between the CMS program as envisioned in staff's proposal and ACC2?
Maybe Steph, I'll just mention at a high level that we are very engaged with Carb. As you know, the statute relies on both the Air Resources Board and the PUC to implement and create this program. So that has been a longstanding conversation, and we envision it will continue to be throughout the implementation of the program. And I'm trying to remember, Steph, if engagement with Carb in particular is addressed in the proposal in some of the work groups. I don't recall the specifics around that, but I think, Adam, I might just treat your question more as a comment that ACC2 is a program that you're interested in making sure is incorporated into the thinking on implementing this the Clean Mile Standard.
Thank you.
No, Tara, if you want me to provide some additional response to that.
Sure, I think we have time, Joshua, that'd be great. I don't see any other hands raised at the moment.
Okay, I'll be brief. It's helpful to have Adam kind of draw the connections to some broader programs. In ACC2,
and,
we don't.
Joshua, just to make sure everyone is aware, Joshua Cunningham is from the Air Resources Board and has led through their rulemaking process on the Clean Mile Standard for the last three years or so.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Just briefly, I think the most tangible synergy is just the scale of the electrification that we're pushing through the automaker regulations for advanced clean cars too. It will help bring more EVs to the supply side for drivers to be able to take advantage of, help bring costs down on EVs in general for any buyer, including TNC drivers. For those who have followed the rule, we do have some specific provisions in there around streamlining infrastructure connections, required ports, convenience cords, durability, warranty requirements, a large number of provisions that will help the owner of the EV, and it'll be particularly helpful for TNC drivers. I guess the one thing I would highlight is, I know access to home charging is problematic for anybody who rents a home. and our requirements in ACC2 for requiring a convenience cord that comes with the car that's capable for 220 volts should help minimize some of the costs for home charging. So yeah, no direct ties to CMS, but all of those things will help TNC drivers in general.
Thank you, Joshua. Right. I haven't seen any other hands raised or comments in the chat. So I think we might be at a place where we can wrap up and thank everybody for the great participation. Steph, do you have any wrap up comments? You're on mute. The first time in the whole workshop.
I have to give myself a break. I do have a closing slide. And again, want to reiterate Tara, what Tara said, and thank you all for joining us and for being active participants on the workshop. I'm really happy with how it went. I'm glad that you all were able to join us today. Thank you to Commissioner Shiroma for your opening remarks and also for asking questions and staying for the full workshop as well. Just another reminder that opening comments on the staff proposal, the deadline has been extended, so now they are due January 30th with reply comments due February 27th. If you would like to become a party to comment on the proceeding, you can find instructions online. You can also contact us at cleanmiles@cpuc.ca.gov or the Public Advisor's Office if you would like help with how to do that, or if you would like more information on how to comment publicly on the docket. Maybe we can include that in our follow-up email as well, just information on becoming a party and also providing public comment, just to make sure that everyone has that information. We will be posting the slides as well as the recording on the CMS CPUC webpage, and I'll include that in the follow-up email as well. And that's it. If you have any follow-up questions, let us know. You can reach us at cleanmiles@cpuc.ca.gov.